before assuming office on the power of his words and speeches, and the issue of what he said and what policies he's enunciated or not has been a matter of great debate, all the way up to last week's West Point speech. No place more than in the Arab world, where the U.S. has had an enormous footprint, certainly during the George W. Bush years, and a decreasing footprint in the years of President Obama. But Obama's campaign itself, the Yes We Can moment in the U.S., really was followed with great emotion in the Arab world. It may have been one of those sort of transformative emotional events that may have also encouraged some to move forward in what ended up being the beginnings of Arab uprisings, the Arab Spring, Arab Winter, different seasons that emerged from those series of events. We have with us, obviously, Mr. James Zogby, who's the head of Zogby Research Services, and this is a well-known polling and research institute that does seminal work in the Arab world. People listen a lot to President Obama. Jim listens to the Arab voices in the Arab world and see what they're saying and what they're thinking. And he's been tracking this opinion for many, many years. So it's very interesting to see the dynamics, the changes, the rise and fall of those opinions. He will address us first and present the results, very interesting results of his findings for about 15 or 20 minutes. Followed by Mr. Marwan Muasher and Ms. Barbara Slavin, and I'll introduce them all now and then leave it to them. James, as I said, is the Managing Director of Zogby Research Services. He's also the founder and president of the Arab American Institute, which is sort of the political and policy arm of the Arab American community in the U.S., a well-known figure. He's a lecturer and scholar on Middle East affairs, a visiting professor at New York University in Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates, author of the Arab Voices. Like me, he's of Lebanese descent. And I just learned on Wikipedia that his father came here in 1922 illegally, but I think that's been cleared up. Jim is here legally. Okay. Jim, good to see you again. There are two commentators. First, Dr. Marwan Muasher, probably known to many of you. Dr. Muasher is currently the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace across the street, where he oversees work on the Middle East done both in Washington and in Beirut at the Carnegie Middle East Center there. In that capacity, Marwan was my boss. I was running the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut until last year. Dr. Muasher also had an illustrious career in the Jordanian government. He was a deputy prime minister overseeing a 10-year plan for political, economic, and social reform in Jordan. Really a historic effort and historic document, which upon completion was sadly shelved, but it really was a historic effort for Jordan and for much of the Arab world. He also served as Jordan's foreign minister, its ambassador to Washington, its ambassador to Israel, member of the Jordanian Senate. And before joining Carnegie, he was the senior vice president of external affairs for the World Bank. And he recently authored a very important book called The Arab Center, The Promise of Moderation, but the new one is called The Second Arab Awakening, on the uprisings and their meaning and how to move forward. So also a well-known author. Our second commentator is Barbara Slavin. Barbara is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. She is the Washington correspondent for the Al Monitor website, almonitor.com, which is a fantastic website for voices and analysis on the Middle East. She's an author of a number of books, including Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. She's a career journalist who's worked in the Middle East and in Washington. She's worked for The Economist, USA Today, Washington Times, New York Times, Week in Review. So we have an excellent panel to share with us their views. And let's start with the leader of this report, Mr. James Zogby. PowerPoint. Technical people, technical help here.
Thank you, Paul. And I want to thank Middle East Institute for hosting. And I want to thank Marwan and Barbara for agreeing to be on the panel with me. It's a pleasure always doing things with Marwan, who I used to call the guy who couldn't keep a job. Because he kept getting elevated up and up and up. And Barbara and I have a longish history, but she was the one who interviewed me for book notes when Arab Voices came out, and the sales went through the roof. Thank you. But she's now with Al Monitor. If you are not somebody who follows Al Monitor every day, you actually should. It's an extraordinary digest of information and original articles from great experts across the region, worth following. When President Obama gave his speech, we had previewed the speech with a poll on his first 100 days in office. We'd actually done an earlier poll in late 2008, I'd say late summer 2008, in which we found that the Bush-era lows had already begun to move. Arabs were very excited about the prospect of a campaign with an African American. And Hillary Clinton as well, who brought some excitement to that. And when we polled and we asked, are you following it closely, the numbers were rather high. I think more people were following it in the Arab world than in America. When President Obama spoke about change, the Arab world needed change and looked to America to provide that change. And so we found a real uptick. We asked, what are the issues you most want him to address in his speech? And they told us ending the Iraq War, they told us closing Guantanamo, they told us solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, etc. We didn't poll again until 2011. And by then, I remember I was at the speech at the State Department when the President spoke. Went to the Middle East, and actually, the President said to me, he said, what do you think of the speech? And I, trying to duck it, said, we're polling on it. He said, I want to know what you think. I said, well, let me tell you what the Arabs are thinking, and I'll know that. And well, when the numbers came back, the numbers were pretty bad. The expectations of 2009 had collapsed. Sure, we were leaving Iraq, but it was a mess. The Arab-Israeli conflict, we were at that point where we started our polling after the speech. And I think the shock in the region of seeing the president being literally humiliated by his own Congress, inviting the prime minister of a foreign country to come and reject the president's message and then get 29 standing ovations for it, and the White House backing off at that point, created a sense of frustration. So we went from the very highs of 2009 to the very lows of 2011, and we actually didn't poll again until this year, when we thought that the 5th anniversary, we might take a look at where Arab attitudes were toward President Obama, but also toward the United States in general, and a range of American policies. Let me start with with the first. Favorable, unfavorables toward the United States this year show some movement. You'll see there's in no country is America above the 50% favorable rating. UAE numbers are highest, followed by Egypt, and interestingly enough, Palestine. Now, if you chart this out over 2006, we had a bit of a high in 2005-06. This was the Bush re-election. It was the change in policy. It was the Annapolis process, etc. There was a bit of a high. In 2008, you had that decline in a couple of countries. In 2009, you had the real surge, in most countries, followed by the dip in 2011-12. Now, Saudi Arabia is the one big exception here where you have a big drop, and this poll was done in the period before the president met with King Abdullah, and the Saudi press has not been favorable toward this administration, largely over Syria. Syria is the issue. But in four of the 7 countries, you have a rise. A slight dip in Jordan, a continued slide in Lebanon for reasons that we'll get into later. A big dip in Saudi Arabia, but still, the numbers overall are, with the exception of the very high in UAE, the numbers are pretty much, and in Lebanon, the numbers are pretty much where they were in 2009. We go now to attitudes toward, this is just a sort of a metric that I look at because we compare a lot of other countries. Saudi Arabia has the highest ratings across the board in most countries, followed by Russia. Iran continues the slide that we've noted since 2006 when it was at the all-time high. And made the point before, this is not a sectarian slide, although sectarianism does fit into it. But it has to do with Iranian policy, and Syria, as I've said in the past, is the icing on the cake. The exception is the Palestinian number. We've only polled Palestine once on this before. A very low we had in 2012, but a much higher number today. Lebanon, again, is an exception to this, and a bit of a slide, but still quite high. Now, Turkey, again, a sort of a comparison I like to make because the Turkish numbers are always interesting. They began quite modest in 2002 when we first polled. We didn't include all that here, but they climbed progressively to 2011 when they were at their highest. But there's a drop in every single country on Turkey. And I might expect it to continue as we go on. The blush is off the rose, one might say. Support for Obama's policies is quite interesting. Negative numbers for does the U.S. contribute to peace and stability in the Middle East? The U.S. numbers are up a little bit in several countries, but the president himself has a more favorable rating than the United States does, a more favorable rating than U.S. policy. And I found it quite interesting to compare the numbers in 2011 when the disappointment was at its greatest with today. And I think we can debate where this comes from. Part of me feels that it is the softer footprint that is having an impact. And I don't find it as a result of actions we've committed as much as actions we've avoided, and that may account for it. But nevertheless, the numbers are strikingly higher than they were. Relations with the United States. I think interesting to note that in every country, majorities say it is important to have good relations with the United States. The darker color says the U.S. has been effective in the Obama administration in maintaining the good relations, but the blue says they're trying, but they're not yet effective. But nevertheless, if you get points for trying, it seems to be having an impact and is worth noting. Now let's look at some very specific policy issues. First is which U.S. policies to pursue vis-a-vis Syria. Syria was the first question that we looked at. We gave a series of options, 7 of them. Of those 7 options, 3 of them involved issues that were non-military, dealing with humanitarian crisis, pursuing negotiations to achieve a peaceful settlement, and the other was leave it alone, the U.S. shouldn't interfere. In every country, other than among the Palestinians, the 3 non-military options ranked highest by far. If you get it, you'll get a copy of the poll later. It is available out front and it's online as well. You'll see the numbers were strikingly higher. In the 40, when we gave them a forced choice of pick one of the above, It was like 40%, 30%, 20%, and then a smattering for using military approaches. When we asked the question, the follow-up question, which of the policies should the United States not pursue? Airstrikes and weapons to the military, to the opposition, advanced weaponry to the opposition, and direct involvement, meaning setting up a no-fly zone or bombing specific targets of the Assad regime. Again, they were far and away the most favored options. This is not something that some Arab leaders are going to favor as a policy, but it is clearly where we found most people on the Arab street to be heading. And it occurred to me that in the West Point speech, the president described an America that was war-weary and wary of war. It appears the Arab world is too. And concerned that America not do another Iraq and another Afghanistan so soon without maybe even a lack of confidence and trust that the U.S. could pull it off. Maybe a sense that, you know, you said you were going to bomb and you didn't. How do we know if we gave you the green light to do it, you'd actually do anything other than make them? I mean, I'm not quite sure how to account for it, but it was striking to me that you hear the Arab world wants direct American involvement, but you find from the Arab street that they don't. And in fact are much more cautious on that. Now, a question on Egypt. We have 3 questions on Egypt. We asked the same questions. I couldn't produce all of the charts for you, but I want to show you. This again is going to not make some folks happy, but it's the numbers that we get. First question we said was, during the presidency of President Mubarak, was the U.S. too supportive, not supportive enough, or just right? Well, I suppose folks would expect, as the numbers did show, that most Arabs said in most countries that the U.S. was too supportive of President Mubarak. Then we asked the question, follow-up question, with regard to President Morsi. Was the U.S. too supportive, not supportive enough? And here you get the numbers. With a striking, I thought, striking numbers, that in Egypt, you had 61% saying not supportive enough. In Morocco, 59% not supportive enough. The only 2 countries where you actually got too supportive was UAE and in Lebanon. But even in Saudi Arabia, you had people saying, with regard to Morsi, almost a split between not supportive enough and too supportive. When we asked the question about the current interim government, only in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE did the numbers come back with majority saying that the U.S. wasn't being supportive enough. Those 2 governments being very heavily invested in supporting the interim government, feeling the U.S. wasn't supportive enough. But in most of the other countries, there was a sort of a split in a division, whether too supportive or not supportive enough. Iran negotiations. I thought interesting that you had a significant number, the yellow, saying that they supported U.S. efforts to achieve a negotiated solution that would limit Iran's nuclear program. Majorities in every country but Lebanon. Confident, though, that the U.S. would succeed in limiting it, that drops. And confident that your country's interests would be served, drops even further. Again, a sense that the U.S., they're glad they're doing it, but not confident that they can pull it off. On Israel-Palestine, pretty much the same thing. We had a couple of questions here. How supportive is the U.S. of a 2-state solution? Are you confident the U.S. is committed to a 2-state solution? Numbers were abysmally low. And are you confident the U.S. can be even-handed in negotiations? Again, very low. On the question of what are the main obstacles to peace and stability in the Middle East, Palestine remains the key. U.S. interference in the Arab world comes in second. Growing religious extremism shows up as concerns in UAE, in Lebanon, and in Egypt. Iran's interference is only a concern in UAE. But issues like democracy, etc., while much is made of that, Lebanon, it's a big question, but less so in every other place except Egypt it registers, Palestine it registers, and among Arabs in the UAE, this is not Emiratis, this is Arabs in the UAE, there's a difference between the two. And so you have a lot of exiles from other Arab countries there being factored into the poll, about 40-60 ratio. I would add that there was one other issue maybe of note, and that we'll save for another time. I think that that's about it. Overall, my takeaway is that an uptick, which is interesting. I don't know how to account for the uptick other than the lower profile. And the less damage you do, the better off you are. And I would say that the other takeaway is not an increase in confidence and trust in the U.S. to deliver, but a more of a personal appeal of the president and the belief that he cares. But can he do it? I think that the sense of optimism of 2009 is gone and will probably not come back in the foreseeable future. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Just say a few words about the timing and sampling methodology, just a bit of
all the polling was done face-to-face. We only do face-to-face. I never do telephone, I never do online. Some people do that, but I think it's cheating because the online penetration is not sufficient in most of the countries to warrant it. In any of the countries, UAE, yes. Lebanon, yes. But you don't get a good read. Secondly, the polling was all done in May. It was we thought that we'd wait until we got the window right before the June speech, the anniversary of the June speech to do it. So they were all done around the same time. Sampling sizes were 1,000 in Palestine, Morocco, Egypt, and UAE, and they were 800 in Jordan, Lebanon, and I'm sorry, in Saudi Arabia, 800 in Jordan, Lebanon, and UAE. And in UAE, we only polled Arabs, Arabic speakers. We didn't poll other expats. And the full methodology is in the poll report. And if you want more of the details, et cetera, just simply contact us. We can provide it. Do you want to go to them?
Yes, I do. So have a seat. Thank you, Jim, for presenting that very interesting results, especially looking at them historically. I'd like to invite Dr. Muasher to share his comments with us.
Thank you, Paul, Jim. Always a pleasure to be with you all, Barbara. I chose 5 areas to comment on as a result of this poll, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. One is, once again, we see that the Arab-Israeli conflict remains at the center of the radar screen of Arab public opinion and what they see as the biggest challenge to Arab-US relations. What is interesting in the poll is that at the same time that public opinion in these countries show the Arab-Israeli conflict to be the main sort of challenge to US-Arab relations, in the same question, if you will, it also shows that US interference in the region is also the second main challenge to US-Arab relations. So it is not clear how how Arabs that were polled expect the Arab-Israeli conflict to be resolved, since in other questions they clearly indicate that there is little confidence that either the US is even-handed or that the US is serious or committed to an independent Palestinian state. It is not clear from the polls what they see as the solution out of this apparent dilemma here. And so that is what the first comment that I want to make. It's interesting to me that 3 years after the Arab uprisings, the Arab uprising doesn't, or democracy and governance also, or economic inequity, if you will, did not come up very strongly in this poll. The second observation I want to make is that support for US policy has been greatest when the US was seen not to be interfering in the region. And that applies in particular, according to the poll, to two areas, Iran and Syria. And this is regardless of what people's position on the Syrian crisis or the Iranian crisis is. So in other words, by coincidence, Pew Research Center just came up with a poll that shows some Arab countries' opinion of Bashar Assad and his regime. And you will see that in Egypt, 66% are against Bashar Assad regime. In Jordan, 78% are against Bashar Assad regime. The Palestinian territories, 65%. In most of these countries that were polled, there is a clear majority of Arab public opinion against the Syrian regime. And yet, according to the poll we are discussing today, that does not translate into Arabs wanting the United States to be directly involved militarily or to provide aid to the opposition. So the Arab public opinion, in other words, is not linked on the issue of Syria to what the Arabs think of the regime. It is linked to what they think of U.S. interference in the region. And if I was an Obama advisor, I would use this poll to say, we've been right on Syria. Non-interference is what the region wants, not just what U.S. public opinion wants as well. The same applies to Iran. In other words, I wonder, the question is phrased in terms of support to a negotiated solution to limit Iran's nuclear program. And I think, in my view, again, that's an issue that we can discuss, public opinion on Iran is more about a negotiated solution than about limiting Iran's nuclear program. In other words, support for US policy there is precisely because a negotiated solution means no war, rather than whether Arabs are interested in limiting Iran's nuclear option or not. I would argue that outside of the Gulf, the Iranian issue, nuclear issue, does not occupy much importance in the Arab world outside the Gulf region. And even in the Gulf region, you can debate whether it is a government position or a public position as well. The third area I want to comment on is support for Mr. Obama, and it is clear that 5 years after the Cairo speech, there is a feeling in the region that the Obama administration has not lived up to its expectation, or at least to the expectations of the speech. And whereas the poll does suggest, some support that has been regained since then, that support, once again, in my view, is due to the United States pulling out of Iran, pulling out or not interfering in Syria, rather than anything else. It's interesting that Obama might find himself at the end of his second administration in the same position that George Bush left us with, ironically, which is to look at the region from a security lens, rather than from a governance lens or from a development lens. Increasingly, the Obama administration has sort of lost whatever enthusiasm it had at the beginning of the Arab uprisings, and has been increasingly looking at the region from a purely security lens. It's basically business as usual with the Arab regimes of the region, and I think that is showing in the polls as well. The fourth point I want to make is the Egypt issue. Support for Sisi, as the poll suggests, is thinner than we thought. And I think that is accurate. I think that whereas the Egyptian sort of propaganda machine, if you will, has shown that Sisi is is God, and any criticism of Sisi is not to be tolerated and is actually tantamount to treason today in Egypt. The polls suggest that this is not exactly the same. If 61% think that the US government has not been supportive enough of the current regime, that suggests that support for Sisi is not as huge or overwhelming as I think the Egyptian current regime wants us to believe. And yet public opinion, according to the poll, is nuanced. And I think that is accurate too. In other words, despite the fact that most Arabs think negatively of the United States, despite the fact that most Arabs do not believe the United States is even-handed or committed to the most important issue that they face, which is the Arab-Israeli conflict. Despite that fact, an overwhelming majority of people polled think that it is important for their countries to have good relations with the United States. So there is no sort of inherent ideological opposition to good relations with the United States. On the contrary, people think it is important. They, I would assume, need these policies to be modified, but they're not ideologically opposed to good relations with the United States. And finally, I want to make two comments with regard to Iran and Turkey. It is clear that Iran has lost considerable support in the Arab world, and I think that is due to two main factors. One, which is the less important, is the Iranian revolution or Iranian domestic crisis of 2009. And more importantly, I think it's Iran's position with regard to the Syrian crisis. If you believe the polls that tell you that most Arab public opinion is against the Assad regime, then you will also see why support for Iran has been consistently dropping in the last 4 or 5 years. The two issues are closely interlinked. Turkey is a very interesting story also, because again, Turkey's, of course, rise in public support in the Arab world is due to the coming 10 years ago or 12 years ago of a Turkish government that has openly and proactively tried to re-establish bridges with the Arab world, that has promoted a policy of zero problems with the neighbors, that has really seriously tried to re-engage with an Arab world that it considered as hostile for the last 70 or 80 years. It adopted a new language, it abdicated the caliphate, it called for a secular state, it looked to the West, all the things that really alienated it from the Arab world. That trend, interestingly enough, which reached its peak, as Jim said, in 2011, again, at the dawn of the Arab uprisings in 2011, despite the fact that Turkey has promoted a Turkish model. In fact, it was Turkey more than anybody else that promoted such a model of governance since the Arab uprisings. The polls do not suggest that Arabs are, I'm speaking now in crude terms, are buying the model. If they were buying the model, if they were buying Turkish support for these uprisings, you would expect the numbers to increase. In fact, they have decreased, and without passing judgment on the Turkish model, you might agree or disagree with at least aspects of it. I don't believe in a model that can be looked at in its entirety. I think it is interesting to look at the reasons why this drop has taken place and the difference in perceptions between the Arab world and Turkey in relation to governance issues. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Marwan. Very insightful comments, very interesting. Let's turn to Barbara Slavin.
Well, it's kind of hard for me to follow those two analyses. I agree pretty much with everything that's been said. There are some things that did strike me as very curious, and the numbers from Egypt in particular, the fact that 61% felt that the United States had not been sufficiently supportive of the Morsi regime was something that I couldn't really wrap my head around, except that perhaps we're beginning to see not nostalgia for Morsi, but certainly a lack of enthusiasm for Sisi. Maybe that accounts for these numbers. We just had the Egyptian elections where the Egyptians had to extend the voting by a third day in order to get people out, and even then there are rather significant doubts about whether 46% of the Egyptian electorate actually turned out to vote for Sisi. So are Egyptians now wishing that Morsi had been left in place? Do they now blame the United States for not helping to ensure that? Do they just blame the United States no matter what we do? Which is perhaps the most plausible explanation, given the disappointments that Egyptians certainly have had with US policy over many, many years. So I found that quite curious. The lack of significance given to the Iranian nuclear issue is not that surprising. I mean, if you look at the challenges here that are listed when you talk about ending Iran's nuclear program, it's pretty much at the bottom of the priority list in every one of the countries that was polled. So this is not, Iran's nuclear program has never been something that Arabs have really seen as a threat directed against them, and I think, Jim, some of the previous polling you've done also showed that Arabs do not see an Iranian nuclear program as a threat, and some actually get a kind of perverse satisfaction out of the notion that yet another country in the Middle East, or a country in the Middle East that isn't Israel, would have nuclear weapons. So not surprising then that they would support a negotiated solution, certainly not surprising that they would oppose any kind of military action against Iran over its nuclear program. Most of the results I found quite uplifting in the sense that the US has gone up a notch, and yes, very supportive of Obama's minimal footprint idea in the Middle East. I looked at his speech last week. I thought it was the Goldilocks speech, you know, not too realist, not too neocon, something sort of nice and warm in the middle that would not get the United States embroiled in more conflicts in the region. And that's clearly where the Arab world is. They have seen what happens when the United States gets involved in regime change in that part of the world, and they certainly don't like the results. So why would they ever want the United States to repeat that experience? And I think that accounts for the numbers on Syria, although Syria is a burning issue. I mean, when you look at these results in terms, again, of the priorities, yes, the Palestinian issue comes out ahead pretty much everywhere, but 68% in Morocco say ending the conflict in Syria is one of the two most important challenges. 63% in Jordan, that's not surprising given the refugee overflows. Only 21% in Lebanon. Now, why would that be? Since Lebanon now has more Syrian refugees than any country in the world. It's something like a quarter of the population. So that is confusing for me. The other question was one of Turkey. Why the turn at that point? Now, the Turks had put their bets down on the Arab awakenings, and some of those turned out well, some of them not so well. But why was 2011 the point? The journalist in me asked that question. Was there, I mean, Turkey presumably was popular for its support for the Palestinian cause, for the flotilla that went and tried to storm Gaza. I thought brought the Turks more popularity, not less. The perception of Erdogan as a tone-deaf autocrat didn't really begin until last year with the Gezi Park demonstrations and the way those were brutally put down by the Turkish state, and the revelations of corruption and so on are all more recent. So I'm a little confused by that. Why the turn came then? Less so now. I mean, I agree with you, Jim, that the blush is off the rose because of Gezi Park, because of all the things that have happened that we've seen, the fight with the Gulen movement and so on. It's certainly, the Turkish model is looking a little battered these days. But overall, I think it's a very interesting report. I mean, what I take the lead, for all of you who are writing about it, is that the Arab world agrees with the Obama administration that the U.S. should not get militarily involved in any more of the conflicts in the region, and that we should have a minimal footprint. That it would be nice if we could solve the Arab-Israeli dispute, but we probably won't. And we should keep negotiating with the Iranians, and maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't, but it's better than all the alternatives. So that's how I would look at it.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And with that, let's turn to the audience, to you, for questions or comments. Please make some comments, and then we'll take Q&A.
I think, Marwan, you hit the nail on the head when you identify the dilemma of Arab opinion sorting out the problems versus the United States as a solver of the problem. And there's I think, a profound ambivalence, and maybe even a bit of a pathology. I think that they can't sort them. On the one hand, and we stopped asking a series of questions years ago. We used to always ask, how do you feel about American policy toward this, and this, and then we'd say, how do you feel about American people, culture, products, and we'd get 90% favorable on the culture. When George Bush said, why did they hate us? They hate our values. We found that they loved our values. It was how we treated them that they didn't like. And I used to argue back then that they judge you not by the values you profess, but whether you apply those values to them. And we stopped asking them because it just got boring. So I think if I look at where the softer or the minimal footprint begins to raise the numbers up, it's because it allows the positive feeling of the driver, which is they like America. They don't like what we do. It then is able to surface instead of the bungling policies that we've been engaged in over the last several years. When we asked another series of questions about which president is the most positive and which is the most negative, Bill Clinton wins enormous praise. Much more than George Bush father. And George W. Bush gets almost universal condemnation everywhere as the worst president. We are living in the house that George built. And I think that is where President Obama that's the dilemma he's confronting. If we had not exhausted ourselves in Iraq and Afghanistan on wars that we couldn't win and would produce the chaos that we're leaving behind, we might have been in a better position to address some of the issues that people want us to address. But on the one hand, they don't want us to. And on the other hand, we appear to have learned some unfortunate lessons, and that is that we can't. If you go into a country and try to sort it out, and you don't know that country to begin with, then you're going to get yourself in trouble, and you're going to prolong the conflict that you, instead of ending it. So I think that the U.S. interference issue is big. We found that the Arab exhaustion with Assad goes back to our 2011 poll. Is when we first found opinion turned against them. But should the U.S. do something about it, that's an entirely different story. Because there still is exhaustion with America. And so it creates this tension and this conflict. On the one hand, they expect us to be better. Sometimes they want us to be better. Don't understand when we're not better. But on the other hand, it's like the woman I remember in the TV dialogue I had with students in America and students in Iraq. She said, you must leave, you must leave, you must leave, but not yet. It's that there's a sense of tension between, leave us alone, don't interfere with us, but what are you doing about this? And they can't quite sort that out. I think, Barbara, the poll we did, that you were one of the commenters on, the 20 nations looking at Iran. Mm-hmm. When the focus is on Iran, you get one kind of view. Mm-hmm. When the focus is on the United States, you get a different kind of view. And so I think that what I gathered from that poll was, yes, Syria is the nail in the coffin for Iran. Yeah. It is the... but what does the U.S. do about it is an entirely different question. What can the U.S. do about it is an entirely different question. I was looking at a poll for maybe helping the administration better understand the region a little bit, but I'm not quite sure that this poll is going to be a prescription for policy as much as it is maybe some avoidance, some things.
It's going to be confirmation.
To be wary of. And on the Morsi numbers,
Yeah.
you know, we polled 3 times in 2013. And I always love it when you get credit for something that you didn't do. But I remember the poll we did that came out within mid-June before Tamarud was Muslim Brotherhood collapsed completely. People were fed up with the Brotherhood's overreach. And we were getting all those numbers coming through. And military had a 93% favorable rating. And so Egyptian television was like inundating me with interview requests about it because they loved the findings. One of the things they didn't pay attention to were 2 questions. One is, granted you're in a problem, how do you get out? What is the best option to get out of it? 80% said national dialogue, national reconciliation. When asked the question about should the military intervene, 40% said yes, 56% said no. After Tamarud, we asked the same sets of questions. Military numbers were still in the 90 range. But the question was how to get out of the problem. 80% said national reconciliation. On the question of military intervention, it was 40%, 56%. We asked the same question in September. By then, the military numbers had dropped to 70. And in the favorable, unfavorable rating, I remember we released this poll and people were questioning it at the time. Morsi's number and El-Sisi's numbers were almost identical. In the just about breaking 50%. Both of them had a 50% or so, 49, 40, something like that percent favorable rating, each of them. And on the question of what do you do, 78% said national reconciliation and dialogue. And on the question of military taking over, was it right for the military to take it? 40% said yes, 56% said no. So the numbers today are just about validate that.
Yeah, and there was a Pew poll also which showed similar figures,
Yeah.
which also showed that Morsi was popular.
So
with
the
46%.
question is not so much that there's Morsi nostalgia, as much as it was, we told you not to go there. There was another way we wanted to solve this. You went the way we didn't want you to go, which was bring back the military. That's not what we did this for. And now, while you can parse out the components of that group, some of them Brotherhood supporters, some of them youthful revolutionaries, some of them, liberals, the social liberals of one sort or another, I think that you were both right that the media perception created in Egypt is quite different than where public opinion is, which is Egyptians are much more nuanced, much smarter, and I think much more conflicted about all this than we give them credit for, or that they're given credit for. They're not all this way. They're not all that way. They're actually torn about how this plays out. So I'll stop. But I just wanted to comment on those issues that were raised.
All right, let's take a few questions. Starting with David.
David Mack from the Middle East Institute. My question is for Marwan. As a former senior Arab government official, how would you explain what seems to be a dramatic disjuncture between what government officials in a couple of countries, I'm thinking particularly of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have told some very experienced UN or US observers who've gone out there, and they come back and say, well, these people don't care at all anymore about the Palestine-Israel problem. They're totally focused on the Iranian threat and the future of Egypt. Is this because there's a big disjuncture between popular views in these countries and the views of the elites that these American opinion makers and former officials and current officials are talking to? Or is it because the Americans are asking the wrong questions and are not just tuned in to listen to what people might want to talk about?
Thank you. We'll take a number of questions from the right side. The gentleman right there. Keep your hand up so the microphone can find you.
Yeah. So it,
Please introduce yourself.
oh, my name is Kenneth Rothschild. It seems to me that when we look at all this polling, we're not really getting a direction. Maybe it's not intended to get a direction. But my question is, with the level of disorder that there currently is in many different situations, where's our best hope? I mean, do we have to construct something that doesn't exist? Because evidently what exists is not offering very much in terms of hope. So it concerns me that we've got this disorder and we don't seem to have a way to go to work our way out of it. So that concerns me a lot.
Thank you. Other questions, sir?
Mohammed Shinaw, the Voice of America. Dr. Zogby, how do you explain the rise in popularity of Obama when people are criticizing him of not doing much to solve the Palestinian problem and lack of commitment to the two-state solution? Second question, how do you reconcile the high favorite opinions of Egyptians toward the United States when anti-American sentiment is in record high in Egypt?
Thank you. Other questions? Let's take a question there, left in the back.
Ira Weiss. I wonder if anyone was willing to speculate on why, when the question was, is the United States even-handed with respect to the Palestine-Israeli negotiations, how do you explain the fact that among all the Arab countries, the country that had the largest acceptance that America was even-handed was Palestine?
Sir?
Nick Filiotis Foundation.
Hold on, get the microphone there. Sorry.
Nick Filiotis Foundation for Middle East Peace. Jim, do the figures on Egypt give us any indications of what we can expect from the forthcoming parliamentary election?
Thank you. Final question in this round. Gentleman right there, second row.
Yeah, Jim Vidarillo. I have a question for all three panelists and then one specifically for Jim. The one for all three panelists is very basic. Do you think that the Obama 2009 speech in Cairo laid the groundwork for the Arab Spring? And my second question for Jim is, why is Lebanon such an outlier? Now, you're obviously know Lebanese really well. Given the fact that only about, 20-25% are Shia Muslims, why would 70%, for example, support Iran? And of course, the other one that Barbara mentioned, and there are several others as well, where Lebanon is just way off the charts. Could you try to explain what's going on there?
Thank you. Let's go to our panel, maybe Barbara first, and explain why is Lebanon so weird, Barbara?
My Lebanese colleagues will correct me, but I believe that some people say that the majority.
That microphone, Barbara, sorry.
My Lebanese colleagues may correct me, but some people say that the Shia are a majority in Lebanon. They're certainly a plurality, so it's far more than 25%, 40% at least, maybe a majority. So that explains why the Lebanese tend to poll in different ways, more supportive of Iran, the Shia, and so on. But there's still, I agree, some oddities in their views of things. In terms of Obama's 2009 speech, no, I don't think it led directly to the Arab uprisings. I would say that, there are so many factors. Marwan has written a brilliant book, and many others have, about what led to the uprisings, mostly poor governance and entrenched dictatorships that looked like they were about to pass power to the next generation. In some cases, had already done that, as in Syria. I'd also give some credit to the Iranian efforts of 2009, when there were massive demonstrations after fraudulent elections. And the techniques that they used, particularly social media, they shared widely with others in the region, including Arab activists who went on to foment Tahrir Square and so on. So lots of reasons for that.
Just to comment on the Lebanese, although it's hard to get fixed data.
There hasn't been a census since 1933, right?
A national census.
Right.
But on the election rolls, which are sort of accurate in terms of citizenship and so on, it's currently about one third Christian, Sunni, Sunni, Shiite, and Christian, it's likely that in overall numbers, Shiite and Sunni numbers are about the same because birth rates in both are very high, and Christian numbers would be in some decline. So it might be 35, 35, 30, or something like that, although it's hard to get a firm number on it. But Marwan?
To David's question, I mean, my own experience suggests in the Arab world that whenever I saw accurate or relatively accurate polls done in the Arab world, the Palestinian question has always been either the number one or the number two concern. If it's not number one, then number one is the economy, which is of course understandable, and number two is the Palestinian question. Even in the Gulf, when Gulf governments talk about Iran as the threat, that is not necessarily what you would hear from a majority of public opinion, even in the Gulf, in my view. It is interesting that Palestinians actually do have higher numbers than the rest of Arabs when it comes to the even-handedness of the United States. And I think you can maybe explain that in terms of the fact that the Palestinians are exhausted of the conflict. They want a solution. They're living under occupation. They want a way out. And if anybody is offering a way out, even not in an even-handed way, they will take it because it is better than the conditions they're living under. For the rest of the Arabs, it's easier to, pass judgment if you're not under occupation yourself. I would also caution against the simplistic, I think, notion that one speech just ignited everybody in the Arab world. That's remember, the speech was not received, favorably by a majority of Arab citizens. I mean, it was received positively by some, but nowhere near a majority. So it's not like the speech just ignited a whole revolution. I would attempt to explain that by other factors, mainly socioeconomic. The social contract between states and their citizens really came to an end with the global financial crisis, with the energy and food prices, with the basically collapse of the rentier system that promised people security in return for their abdicating their political rights. And when that formula started to be tested with the conditions in the Arab world, that's when the Arab uprising started to happen. I would also say that economic liberalization, which took place in the Arab world in the last 20 years, which was not accompanied by a political reform process, actually led to a dramatic increase in corruption. And if there is one factor that unites all Arab publics across the Arab world, it is this issue of corruption. Corruption has dramatically increased in the last 15 years. If you look at TI's corruption perception index, all of these countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, most if not all of the Arab countries witnessed a dramatic increase in people's perception of corruption in their countries in the last 15 years. Because when you do economic liberalization without developing a system of checks and balances to address abuses institutionally when they happen, corruption is bound to take place. And I think these factors probably combined might offer more of an answer of why it happened now than the speech by President Obama.
Let me start with the Lebanon numbers first. We had the same issue when we did the Iran poll, and it was about a year and a half, maybe a little more than that ago. And we found the numbers for Lebanon to be pretty much out of sync with everybody else's. I would reinforce what Paul and Marwan said about the demographics in Lebanon. It's about a third. We sometimes get a 35-30 split, Christians being the smaller group. But this poll, we had Christians at 35, Shia at about 34, and Sunni a little less. But you know, as you work randomly, that's what you're going to come up with, is about a third. The attitude toward Iran, though, is different in Lebanon than the attitude toward Syria. And it is because Iran has a relationship with Lebanon that is different than the United States' relationship. After the 2006 Israeli invasion, Iran stepped in and did enormous things to help reconstruct the country without discrimination as to the area of involvement. The entire infrastructure was gone without conditions, as U.S. Congress puts on support for Lebanon. The Iranians came in and they were very involved. I was not surprised by the numbers because we'd seen them before. But if you look at the rest of the Lebanon numbers, they're not such outliers. They're not so strange. They actually are. They're numbers that speak to Lebanon's interest. Barbara, I just to take issue with your quote about ending the Syria conflict at 21%. This was a forced choice question, saying the Obama administration has faced several challenges. Which are the two most important challenges that they faced? Ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was number one, and ending the Iraq was number two, the war, and improving relations with the Arab Muslim world was number three. All of those in the 40% range. And then in the 30% range were the Syria ones and the Arab Spring. Mm-hmm. This was not asking the Lebanese, what's the most important issue for you?
Okay.
It was asking, what's the most important issue for the United States? And then in the next one, it was, what is the most effective, on which issue has the U.S. been most effective? And on ending the conflict in Syria, the Lebanese said 3% said they were effective, whereas 39% said, on improving ties with the Arab world, et cetera. They gave them nice grades for other things, but not on that one. And then on the issue of dealing with the Syria conflict, what the Lebanese said, pointing to exactly where they are, what is the policy the U.S. should pursue, 70% said leave Syria alone, because the expectation is U.S. starts bombing Syria, Lebanon gets more refugees. But 63%, they were given two choices. 63% said the humanitarian crisis of the refugees, that's Lebanon's direct interest. And then the third one was negotiations to just end the conflict. They did not want an acceleration of the conflict, and that is clearly, I think, a Lebanese perspective on this. And so I didn't find the numbers, the Iran ones always puzzle me, but these didn't. Yeah.
Just two fingers. I mean, it's still stark. I mean, it says which two of the following challenges are the most important for U.S.-Arab relations. Mm-hmm. Why would Jordan say 60? Why would 63% in Jordan say ending conflict in Syria and only 21% in Lebanon? It still doesn't quite compute.
Well, the two issues for Lebanon, first, Jordan, where 71% said the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Followed by ending conflict in Syria. It just seems strange.
Look at the Lebanon numbers and look at the UAE numbers. Two societies that are kind of interesting, each in their own way, mm-hmm. in terms of having a much more engaged public debate on issues. The UAE numbers are all over the place, just like the Lebanon numbers, evenly split on several levels. So I didn't find, whereas Jordan is fixated on two questions: Israel, Palestine, and Syria. So now the next one. The next one is the question about why Palestinians give the highest rating. Maybe because they have more direct exposure to the U.S. at this point. Maybe because the president has said some things that others didn't say. Went there, his Jerusalem speech, we remember, people here remember what he said about Israel, but Palestinians will remember that very powerful moment in the middle of the speech where he stopped and talked about Palestinian young people and their rights and their needs. And the U.S. has been engaged on this. So I think that, it didn't surprise me too much that the numbers were more favorable. I was surprised overall that there were any favorable numbers. I actually thought we were going to get a very different poll than we got. It was more nuanced than I expected. On the UAE, Saudi Arabia, again, if you take them and look down the columns, just don't compare them with the others, but look and try to see them in and of themselves. The UAE numbers in particular are the most concerned with Iran, more than the others. The UAE numbers were much more hostile toward Iran, as were the Saudis than any of the others. I mean, 1% favorable rating for Iran and Saudi Arabia. Their government may not be that far off in terms of their attitude. 19%, the lowest, the UAE, the lowest rating they give is 19%. And remember, you have 500,000 Iranians living in the UAE, and Dubai and Abu Dhabi, with regard to the issue of Iran, are like red state, blue state. You know, and a huge component of the economy of Dubai is with Iranian trade, and yet only a 19% favorable rating there. So, you know, how to explain UAE, Saudi Arabia? I mean, look at the numbers, and you'll see that their governments aren't that far off. They see the threat across the water. They see still in the if we're living in the house that George built, the Arabs in the Gulf are still living in the house that Ahmadinejad built, where he was, you know, preying off of fear and frustration and anger among the Arabs, people in the Arab street, for the failure of their governments to directly confront Israel and what it was doing in 2006 and 2008, and saying, they're not speaking, I am. That's why in those years Ahmadinejad's numbers went up and Hezbollah's numbers went up. That's why Erdogan's numbers went up. That scene with Perez and then the breaking the ties with Israel were huge. And now things are settling down on both fronts. And so, you know, each country has its own unique characteristics, its own unique concerns. And I think if you look at them individually down columns, you begin to see the character and the concerns of each of the countries playing out in their own unique ways.
Thank you, Jim. Let's take another round of questions from the back.
Oh, sorry. There were a lot of questions.
You took note of some of those. Can you answer
I
some of them
actually
before
did.
we go on to the...
I actually did, but I thought I did. What? How about what?
How would you explain the rise of Obama's popularity compared to 2011, when Arabs are disappointed in the lack of progress in the Palestinian issue? And second, how do you reconcile the high opinions of Egyptians toward the U.S. when anti-American sentiment record high?
And your question?
My question was, I mean, the polls reflect history mostly. So my question was concerning, where do we go from here? In other words, where are people looking to move forward and get out of this morass?
Thank you. Jim, can you try to answer
Look,
those?
I think that the president once said, in commenting to me on one of my earlier polls, I said, numbers are low, Mr. President. He said, and they're not going to change until the Israeli-Palestinian issue is solved, until we do something direct on that. And I think he's right. I mean, it's like, I remember when they did Builders for Peace, and you had Palestinian and Israeli businessmen talking to each other. And if they were talking about business, they talked about business. But the minute you talk politics, all hell broke loose. It's the same in the Arab world about America. You can talk about an American movie, you can talk about an American television show, you can talk about American values and culture and all aspects of America, and conversation is delightful. Begin to talk about policy, and it's Palestine, and why aren't you doing more? And so that to me is the nub of it.
But who's going to take the leadership?
Well, obviously we got a government here that ought to be doing something. I've been arguing either do it or step aside and let the UN do it, or let the international criminal, let somebody do it. If you can't, let somebody do it. But don't keep pretending with endless talks where you're not going to use the pressure you need to make a difference. I mean, I think that that's what people want. So the point is, if America keeps changing the subject, they can get away. You can go up to 30% by changing the subject, but at some point you come back to the subject, and when you come back to the subject, you pay a price for it. Now, given that, I think that the subject got changed a little bit over the last couple of years, and there are other things going on that distract people's attention. And you're right. I mean, I look at the individual issues. They're not really happy with what we've done on Egypt. They're not really happy with, or confident that we'll do anything with Iran. Happy we're negotiating, but not happy we'll achieve anything. Not confident. Certainly not confident we'll do anything about Israel-Palestine. They didn't want us to get into another war, and we didn't. But I think at the end of the day, there are still these positives. There's the push and the pull in polls, you know, and the stuff that keeps pushing the numbers up is that fundamentally they like us. And you got an African-American president who has a story that is compelling, and an American people whose culture remains compelling in the region. And so, I mean, I can, you know, until if I were to do focus groups, I might give you a better answer, but we didn't commission focus groups on this. All I can do is observe. Numbers are up. And I think, as Barbara says, that's a good thing. How and why they're up, I can only speculate because I don't have a direct answer.
Thank you, Jim. Can we take another round and then come back? Time is a bit short. The final round of ladies.
I want to hear what he has to say.
No, we'll come back
Yeah.
to Marwan. Let me get a few questions.
I had asked a question.
Hold on.
Okay.
We'll get back to that.
My name is Charlotte Beck. I have a question regarding the perception of U.S. interference in the Arab world. So we heard that generally the belief is that there should be less U.S. interference. But I was wondering whether that really relates to the military aspect of interference, or whether that also speaks to interference in terms of democracy promotion, for example. And I guess here in Washington there are a lot of institutions and people who care about kind of increasing the importance of democracy promotions in the U.S. approach to the region. And what do we do in terms of, I mean, what can we learn from the results of the polls in terms of what that actually, or how that is perceived in the region, and whether that is something that is actually wanted, or whether maybe that kind of democracy assistance or promotion from the U.S. is also something that's not really appealing in the Arab world.
I can see the panelists taking notes of the questions, so we won't miss them. Yes, sir, the second row, and then the first row.
Amit Pandya. I may have been mistaken, but did it seem that Palestine was an outlier in wanting to arm the Syrian opposition? And I wondered if one of you might speak to that.
Thank you, Amit. In the first row. Right there.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hassan. I was born in Tehran, and I am a Muslim. And for the past hour, we've been hearing the Arab world's opinion, kind of excluding the Muslim world opinion, of course, that will come to pass. And I wondered what the panel's opinion is about the time that Egypt, Turkey, and Iran realigned themselves with the Golden Triangle to take charge of that area and push their agenda toward better life for their people.
Thank you. Any questions that I might have missed in this area? In the back, lady in the back? Two ladies in the back, so.
Hi, my name is Caroline Pomplin. I'm a physician. My question is for Mr. Zogby on Iran and on Syria. Do you get to talk to the administration or to Congress? I was at a talk a couple days ago. This Georgetown professor had written a book saying something like, let's attack Iran now. And he seemed to feel that there was complete consensus among our leadership that negotiations would probably fail and containment was an inadequate strategy, and we should just have quote-unquote strategic surgical strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, and we should just tell the Israelis when the retaliation came from Hezbollah and Hamas that they should just absorb it. There seems to be a complete disconnect between what Congress thinks and what people in the region think, not to mention people in this country.
Thank you. The lady behind her.
Thank you. Betsy Super, I have a question about the way we're reading the poll, which, as I understand, the subject of the poll is about Obama and America. And we're using it to both reflect on the U.S.'s role and then also Arab public opinion about domestic governments. So I'm curious, from your other knowledge of other polling or TI data or anything like that, if you asked what's the most important issue right now, to be a traditional polling question, would we get different results if it wasn't about the U.S.? So would they say corruption? Would Arab-Israeli issues be so high? These types of things. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any final question?
Can I do that? And then the question that came up about interference, those terms, while they're fresh. We also poll in the Arab world on priorities. And the top priorities in most countries have always been the economy, healthcare, and education. Sound familiar? Yeah. They're people. What we found was, after Arab Spring, was that not up into the top three, but and we did that Marwan with you at Carnegie. We released that one when you were there. It was a poll we did in 7 Arab countries on political priorities, and I noted that there was this, I called it the Arab Spring effect, which was that in countries where political issues had been previously in the bottom, 11, 10, 9, increased participation, democracy, whatever, now all of a sudden crept into the top 5 or 6. Didn't replace employment or healthcare or education, but came up pretty high. And so, yeah, if you poll on what you want in your country versus what you want from America, you get a different thing. When we used to poll this way, we did it 3 different times and it came out the same way, so I stopped doing it. We asked them, what are your priorities? Economy, healthcare, education, right? And then the other stuff. And then the other stuff would be ranked down. Then we'd say, what do you want most from the United States? Solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Almost universal was the #1 issue. After the Iraq War, it was end the Iraq War. And then creeping up in some countries, like Morocco, few of the countries, would be help increase employment and employment opportunities, improve our educational system, some of that stuff. Democracy issues were smack at the bottom. And I used to say in comment on that I said, it's like if during the healthcare debate, the Swedes had come over and said, we really can help you figure this out because we know how to do it. Or the Canadians or the Brits had said, we know exactly what you need. We would have gone crazy. If the Japanese had said, we can help you with your handgun debate, it's like, are you kidding me? Or Hugh Hefner coming to you and saying, I can help you with your marriage issues, It's like, you kind of, they don't look at us the way we see ourselves. And so democracy promotion is a fool's errand from our, and I hate that, there's a lot of people involved in the institution. It's a cottage industry here in town. And there are takers on the other end who want it, But, I always get a kick out of this, they refuse to allow us to give money to these groups that are promoting democracy in their, or they want them to report. Well, damn, I've been through the Foreign Agent Registration Act stuff in this country enough times to know we don't let foreign governments come in here and give money to our handgun control people, right? These are issues, and it's not so much that the governments don't want it. People don't, in the main, see us as the democracy promoter. They see us as the people who can best solve problems that we helped create, or that they hold us responsible for creating, and otherwise leave them alone or help. And I think President Obama's speech on the May 25th, I think it was, as 2011, on the 2nd anniversary of the speech, it was rather interesting because he spoke about Arab Spring and then the Arab-Israeli conflict, and he framed it this way. He said, the region is in turmoil. We didn't start it. We can't move it forward. We can't be the determiners of how it comes out. But what we can do is help them build capacity by creating jobs and investment and help them with a better future to build a middle class. And the other thing he said we can do, we can help solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. He got it, but Congress didn't. And so I think that the understanding of this in context is that stop, take the thorn out of the toe that's causing all the pain, get out of Iraq, solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, and then help people build a better life. And frankly, that would be the best way. You want to talk about moving forward, that's what people want to move forward. And I'll leave my colleagues to deal with the other issues.
Let me go back to the question that was asked about where do we go from here. The polls are not this poll. Every poll that has been done about the Arab world has shown clearly that the Arab-Israeli conflict is seen by Arab public opinion as the biggest obstacle to US-Arab relations, and that the image of the United States until the Iraq War has been almost exclusively colored by what Arabs perceive as a biased opinion of the US against the Palestinians. Of course, the Iraq War did not help, added to that, and I'll come to that and to the issue of democracy promotion. But whether we agree with this or not, there is a perception in the Arab world that the United States either does not try hard enough to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict or gives Israel enough excuses to perpetuate an occupation that in the end is going to make a solution impossible, even if the United States tries genuinely to do that. And we have seen that, I think, very clearly. It's been 20 years since Oslo, the process that was supposed to take 5 years. Instead, it took 20. Settlement activity doubled in the meantime, and today we are facing a solution where we might find a two-state solution impossible to implement, even if we arrive at one tomorrow. The question to ask is, the United States knows what it needs to do if it wants better relations with the Arab world. There's no dearth of information on what the United States needs to do if it wants better relations with the Arab world. Now that's a big if, because if it is going to come at the expense of its relations with Israel, then the answer has been clear by the United States. Basically, fine, the polls are what they are, we don't care. We don't care because, the relationship with Israel is seen as a zero-sum game, and in the end, it matters more to us than the relationship with the Arab world. Ironically, we are at a situation in the Arab-Israeli conflict where I think the United States basically, now this is a personal opinion, refusing to take enough of a leadership position has taken itself out of the game. Okay, the last negotiations that we have seen with Kerry, I think, is the last one. And I think that the issue of a two-state solution is drawing to a close. And that we are going to start seeing alternative scenarios, whether we like them or not. Whether it is the EU stepping in and taking a larger role, whether it is the Palestinians calling for equal rights within the state they live in and start talking about a one-state solution, whatever scenarios are out there, all of which are not friendly to the United States, and neither to Israel, I might add. But I think the United States has helped put itself in this corner, and it has, as we all do, have to deal with the consequences of that policy or lack of policy. The issue of democracy promotion, I totally agree with Jim. Look, the United States has zero credibility promoting democracy in the Arab world. Okay? Whether we like it or not, zero. Zero credibility. Whether it is done by governments, as George Bush attempted to do through brute force, and 10 years later, I doubt that anybody will argue that democracy has been brought to the Middle East after the war in Iraq, or whether it is done by well-meaning, NGOs, democracy promotion groups that are attempting to do well in the Middle East, but that are still seen by the overwhelming majority of public opinion as agents of official American foreign policy. That's too harsh for you and us, but that's the reality in the Middle East. Any NGO in the Arab world will think twice, maybe thrice, before they would accept money from an American institution, even if they badly need it, because of the baggage that comes with it. And it's a reality. It's something that one has to deal with. I've done a lot of polls when I was in government, a lot of polls. Of course, most of them related to my own country. And again, as Jim suggested, when Jordanians, let me say in my own country, when Jordanians are asked, what is the most important issue for you? Okay, and Jordan, as you know, is very close to Palestine. It is 50% say the economy. But it is closely followed by the peace process. 35% say the Palestinian conflict. I can speak about Jordan, but I think that is more or less accurate in many, if not most, Arab countries. That the economy and the Palestinian conflict come sort of as the two most pressing challenges to Arabs. Now, you talk about governance and political reform. And I think the polls need to parse this further, because while people would, if you ask them about political reform, you might get 15%. This is pre-Arab uprising. I don't know what the ratio is now. But among the issues they worry regarding the economy, it is corruption, it is the rule of law, etc. All issues that seem to be economic in nature, but that cannot be satisfactorily addressed without a political reform process and without building a system of checks and balances. Is that link made in the average person's eye in the Arab world? I doubt it. So they want a clean government, okay? They want jobs. They want corruption to be fought, but they associate all that with socio-economic issues rather than with political reform issues.
The two exceptions to that are Egypt and Lebanon, where historically, I mentioned the three that were the top three. The only countries where there's another one in the top three mix at different times are those two, where corruption and nepotism, which we put together, have always been high. And were high before Arab Spring, during Arab Spring, and at this point, corruption and nepotism in both countries remain high. And I think they do make that, in those two countries anyway, they make that connection because it's so direct.
Barbara?
A word in support of IRI, NDI, NED. I think these people would tell you that they're building capacity in these countries. They're not trying to engineer democracy, and that they've learned from the mistakes that were made and the problems caused by the Bush administration. So a lot of good people in the democracy community. And I think in your Iran poll that democracy and human rights ranked fairly high, as I recall.
Yeah, Iran
was an outlier on that, perhaps.
Outlier.
On the question of surgical strikes on Iran's nuclear program, there is no such thing. Collateral damage would occur. It would be the one thing that would revive Iran's reputation in the Arab world and the larger Muslim world. If the United States were to attack Iran, I can assure you its popularity ratings would probably jump overnight. And Congress, we in the think tank community are constantly trying to educate Congress about the realities of the world, but unfortunately most of them don't have passports, and those who do take a one-week trip to Israel every 4 or 5 years, and that's it. So they don't know the Muslim world at all, and generally not much about the true sentiments of people. So we have to try to educate them. That's all we can do.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Jim Zogby first for doing these polls and continuing to do them over the years. Very rich data for us to talk about and analyze. So I want to thank Jim. I want to thank Marwan, Muasher, and Barbara Slavin.
Institute and the panel, but also tell you that you can get the full results outside or not online at AAI USA or at ZogbyResearchServices.com. One word, .ZogbyResearchServices.com. Thanks.